Most people believe they know what good and bad mean. They've never questioned it. They don't feel the need to. That's usually where the problem begins. When I started reading this book, I expected philosophy. Abstract ideas, difficult language, maybe some clever arguments. What I didn't expect was how quickly it turned into something personal. Not emotional in an obvious way, more like a quiet disturbance, the kind that doesn't shout but doesn't leave you alone either. The book starts by challenging something almost everyone takes for granted, the idea that morality is universal, that there is a fixed definition of good and evil that applies to all people, in all times, in all situations. We grow up believing this without ever asking who decided it or why. And that question matters more than it seems. Because once you ask where morality comes from, you start noticing something uncomfortable. Moral rules don't just describe behaviour, they shape it. They reward certain traits and punish others. They tell people what kind of person is acceptable to be and what kind isn't. That's when it slowly becomes clear that morality isn't neutral. It doesn't float above human life like an objective truth. It grows inside human life, inside fear, inside power struggles, inside survival, inside resentment, inside the need for order. The book doesn't say people are evil for following moral rules. It says something more unsettling. Most people follow them without ever examining who those rules serve. Think about how often good behaviour is associated with obedience, humility, patience, self-denial, and how often bad behaviour is associated with ambition, dominance, confidence, pride. That pattern isn't accidental. It didn't appear out of nowhere. Values are created by people, and people create values based on their position in life. When someone feels strong, capable, secure, they tend to value strength, independence, self-assertion. When someone feels vulnerable, restricted, powerless, they tend to value safety, restraint, equality, and control. Over time, those preferences harden into moral judgments. What starts as survival becomes virtue. One of the most striking ideas in the book is that guilt is not just an emotion, it's a mechanism, a way of keeping people aligned without force. Once guilt is internalized, no authority is needed. People correct themselves, they punish themselves, they feel ashamed for wanting more, for standing out, for refusing to sacrifice. And the system works quietly. You don't need chains when someone believes they deserve the cage. This is where the book becomes deeply uncomfortable, because it asks you to look at your own values and wonder how many of them came from reflection, and how many came from conditioning, from repetition, from approval, from fear of being seen as wrong. Most people don't realize how much comfort morality provides. It gives structure. It simplifies the world. It tells you who the good people are and who the bad ones are. It gives you certainty in situations that are actually complex and unclear. Certainty feels safe. Truth doesn't. Truth demands responsibility. Comfort offers excuses. That's why moral certainty spreads so easily. Once a belief becomes moralized, questioning it feels dangerous. You're no longer disagreeing. You're offending. You're threatening identity, and identity fights back hard. The book also challenges the way religion has shaped moral thinking, not by mocking belief, but by examining its psychological role. Religion often answers the hardest questions before you're forced to confront them yourself. Why suffer? Why obey? Why accept limits? Why restrain desire? There is always an explanation, and almost always it asks you to wait, to endure, to trust that meaning will arrive later, somewhere else, at some other time. That promise can be comforting, but it can also become a way of postponing life. One of the most unsettling realizations the book triggers is how much people prefer comfort over truth. Not because they're weak or foolish, but because truth destabilizes the structures that make life feel manageable. It removes the safety net. It replaces rules with responsibility. Most people don't actually want that. They want to know they're already good, already right, already on the correct side of things. They want validation, not transformation. And morality, when left unquestioned, gives them exactly that. But once you start noticing this, something changes. You hear moral language differently. You notice how quickly people turn values into weapons. How fast conversations become defensive. how often goodness is used to shut down curiosity rather than encourage it. The book doesn't give you a new moral system to replace the old one, and that's what makes it disturbing. There's no list of rules to follow, no clear path laid out, just an insistence that if you're going to live honestly, you'll have to examine the values you inherited, and decide which ones actually serve life, growth, and strength, and which ones simply preserve comfort and control. That realization doesn't arrive all at once. It settles slowly, like a weight you weren't aware you were carrying, a sense that the world is more human, more psychological, more strategic than you were taught to believe. And once that awareness takes root, you begin to sense that morality might not be the final authority you thought it was, that it might be a story people tell themselves to feel safe, and that questioning it isn't about becoming cruel or chaotic, but about understanding how deeply your thinking has been shaped before you ever chose to think for yourself. Once you start seeing morality as something created rather than discovered, another layer slowly comes into focus. It's not just what people believe that matters, it's why they need to believe it so strongly. What surprised me while reading was how rarely people examine the emotional role their values play in their lives. Values aren't just ideas, they're stabilizers. They help people manage fear, uncertainty, and chaos. And when a belief helps someone feel grounded, questioning it feels like pulling away a support beam. That's why moral certainty is often louder than moral understanding. The book keeps returning to this uncomfortable observation. People don't cling to their values because they've tested them. They cling to them because letting go would mean standing alone with unanswered questions, and most people would rather be wrong with others than uncertain by themselves. Once that idea settled in, I started noticing how quickly morality turns social. It doesn't stay internal for long. It looks for agreement, validation, numbers. The moment a belief is shared widely, it gains authority. Not because it's truer, but because it's safer. That's how the herd forms. The herd isn't stupid, it's cautious. It values stability over risk, predictability over exploration, and it rewards behaviours that preserve harmony while discouraging behaviours that introduce tension. Over time, those preferences become moral judgments. What keeps the group comfortable becomes good. What disrupts it becomes bad. This is why standing out feels risky, even when you're not doing anything harmful. Difference alone can feel threatening to a group built on sameness, and morality becomes the language used to justify that discomfort. It's not that you're different, it's that you're wrong. The book doesn't argue that groups are evil. It argues that groups tend to moralize their own survival instincts, and once survival instincts wear the mask of morality, they become very hard to question. I started paying attention to how often words like normal, appropriate, and responsible are used. They sound neutral, but they carry weight. They quietly define the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. Stay within them, and you're fine. Step outside, and something shifts. In tone, in reaction, in how people look at you. What's powerful about this system is how little force it requires. No one needs to threaten you. No one needs to punish you directly. You adjust yourself. You anticipate disapproval. You soften your opinions. You keep certain thoughts private. You learn the emotional cost of nonconformity without ever being told explicitly. The book makes it clear that this is one of the most effective forms of control, not external pressure, but internal regulation. When values are deeply internalized, people become predictable, manageable, easy to govern. That's where the discussion of strength and weakness becomes more psychological than physical. Strength in this sense isn't about domination. It's about the capacity to endure uncertainty, to tolerate disapproval, to exist without constant validation. Weakness isn't about lack of ability, it's about dependence. Dependence on approval, on rules, on moral reassurance. One of the more unsettling ideas is how resentment can shape values without people realizing it. When someone feels blocked, unable to act, to compete, to express themselves, frustration doesn't always turn outward. Often it turns inward and reshapes perception. What they can't have becomes immoral. What they can't do becomes wrong. What others achieve becomes suspicious. This isn't usually conscious, it's psychological self-protection. If reaching for more feels impossible, it's comforting to believe that wanting more is somehow corrupt. If asserting yourself feels dangerous, It's reassuring to believe that humility is superior. Over time, these emotional adjustments solidify into moral positions, and once they're moral, they feel justified. The book doesn't suggest that ambition is always good or restraint is always bad. It suggests that when values are born from fear or frustration rather than clarity, they quietly limit life. They narrow possibility. They reduce complexity into simple judgments. That's when morality stops being a guide and starts becoming a cage. What really stood out to me was how rarely people notice this process happening inside themselves. It's much easier to see moral bias in others, much harder to admit that your own values might be shaped by comfort rather than truth. Because truth, when you strip away guarantees, is demanding. It doesn't tell you what kind of person to be. It doesn't reward you with instant approval. It asks you to decide, and to live with the consequences of those decisions without hiding behind collective certainty. That's a heavy burden, and most people avoid it, not out of laziness, but out of exhaustion. Thinking deeply is tiring, standing alone is tiring, doubt is tiring. Morality, when inherited, offers rest. But rest has a cost. The more you rely on external values to define your worth, the less practiced you become at defining it yourself. Over time, that dependence feels normal, necessary, even virtuous, and questioning it starts to feel reckless, selfish, or dangerous. That's why the book doesn't try to tear morality down aggressively. It simply exposes how human it is, how emotional, how strategic, how shaped by history, power, and psychology rather than eternal truth. Once you see that, something subtle happens. Moral judgments lose some of their absolute authority. Not all at once, gradually. You start pausing before reacting. You notice when a belief feels more protective than illuminating. You become aware of how often rightness is used to avoid responsibility. And that awareness doesn't give you easy answers. It gives you something more unsettling. Choice. The choice to question values instead of inheriting them. The choice to tolerate discomfort instead of immediately reaching for certainty. The choice to accept that living honestly may require letting go of the safety that unquestioned morality provides. And once that door opens, even slightly, it becomes harder to ignore how much of life has been shaped, not by deliberate understanding, but by quiet agreement, by rules absorbed early, reinforced often, and defended fiercely, especially when they begin to feel less like truths and more like habits that have gone unexamined for far too long. As those ideas kept unfolding, the focus slowly shifted from society to something more personal. It wasn't just about how groups create values. It was about what happens inside an individual who starts to question them. Because the moment you stop treating morality as absolute, a strange silence appears. Rules used to tell you what to do. Beliefs used to guide your reactions. Suddenly they don't feel as solid. And in that gap, something uncomfortable shows up. Responsibility. Not the surface level kind, but the deeper one. The responsibility of deciding who you are without leaning on ready-made answers. The book keeps circling around this point without ever stating it directly. Most people don't fear chaos as much as they fear responsibility. Chaos is external. Responsibility is internal. Chaos can be blamed. Responsibility can't. That's why so many people prefer clear rules over open questions. Rules relieve you of choice. They tell you what's allowed, what's forbidden, and who you're supposed to be. Choice, on the other hand, forces you to confront uncertainty, and uncertainty exposes you. I started noticing how often people say they want freedom, but what they actually want is permission. Permission to act without guilt. Permission to want without shame. Permission to exist without explaining themselves. True freedom, the kind that comes without guarantees, is much rarer and much heavier. The book suggests that when people are given freedom without structure, many of them don't feel liberated. They feel anxious, lost, overwhelmed. So they look for something to hold on to. Ideology, identity, moral certainty. Anything that tells them, this is who you are, this is how you should live. That's when obedience begins to feel comforting rather than restrictive. One of the most subtle insights in the book is how often people mistake obedience for virtue. Following rules feels safe. It feels respectable. It allows you to say, I did what I was supposed to do. And as long as you can say that, you don't have to examine whether those rules actually make sense for your life. This is where the idea of good conscience becomes interesting. People don't just want to act morally, they want to feel moral. That feeling matters more than the outcome. As long as your conscience feels clean, the deeper consequences of your actions rarely get questioned. And conscience itself is not neutral. It's shaped, trained, conditioned over time. What makes one person feel guilty might not bother another at all, yet each believes their reaction is self-evident, natural, unquestionable. The book quietly dismantles that assumption. It suggests that conscience is not a divine voice or a universal guide. It's a psychological result of repeated reinforcement: praise, punishment, approval, rejection. Over years, these experiences solidify into an inner judge, and once that judge lives inside you, you don't need external control anymore. That realization changes how you understand concepts like self-discipline and self-control. They're often praised as personal strengths, but the book asks whether they are always chosen, or whether they're sometimes inherited restraints disguised as virtue. Not all restraint is bad, not all discipline is oppressive, but when restraint exists without awareness, it quietly limits what feels possible. You stop questioning not because you've decided to stop, but because questioning itself starts to feel wrong. I noticed how often people justify their limitations using moral language. I shouldn't want that. That kind of ambition is selfish. That's not the right way to live. Sometimes those statements come from clarity, but often they come from fear. Fear of failing, fear of standing out, fear of being judged if they try and fall short. The book doesn't shame this fear, it exposes it. It suggests that many moral judgments are actually emotional defences. They protect people from confronting their own unrealised potential, because potential is uncomfortable. It raises questions, it creates pressure. It asks, what if you could do more than you're doing now? For some people, that question feels motivating. For others, it feels threatening, and morality becomes a way to quiet it. This is where the idea of self-creation starts to take shape. Not as something heroic or dramatic, but as something deeply unsettling. If values aren't fixed, if meanings aren't given, if identity isn't predetermined, then you're left with the task of shaping yourself. No script, no guarantee of approval. That task is heavier than it sounds. It means accepting that your life is not an argument you're trying to win, but a process you're responsible for. It means you can't hide behind "that's just how things are forever." At some point you have to decide what you stand for, and why. Most people postpone that moment as long as they can. They fill their lives with noise, with routines, with obligations, with borrowed opinions, anything that keeps the deeper questions at a distance. Not because they're lazy, but because those questions don't come with comforting answers. The book doesn't offer solutions here. It doesn't tell you how to live. It doesn't give you a checklist for self-creation. Instead, it makes one thing clear. If you never question the values guiding your life, you're not really choosing, you're complying. And compliance, when mistaken for morality, becomes invisible. That's what makes this realization so quiet and so powerful. There's no dramatic collapse, no sudden awakening, just a growing awareness that much of what you thought was right might actually be familiar. That many of the rules you live by may have been accepted long before you understood them. And that stepping outside those rules doesn't immediately make you free, but it does force you to confront something most people spend their lives avoiding. The uncomfortable, inescapable fact that meaning isn't waiting to be found somewhere else. It has to be created, slowly, deliberately, and without the comfort of knowing for sure that you'll be understood while you're doing it. As the idea of self-creation started to settle, another question naturally followed, one that the book keeps returning to in different forms. If values are created, not discovered, then who gets to create them? And more importantly, who has historically been allowed to? This is where the discussion quietly turns toward power. Not the obvious kind, but the subtle kind that shapes meaning itself. The book suggests that values don't appear in a vacuum. They emerge from lived conditions, from struggle, from hierarchy, from who has the ability to act and who doesn't. Over time, the perspectives of those who lack power tend to shape morality in very specific ways, often without realizing it. Not out of malice, out of necessity. When people feel constrained, blocked, or unable to express their instincts freely, they adapt psychologically. They learn to reinterpret their limitations in ways that protect their self-respect. Instead of seeing restriction as a disadvantage, they transform it into virtue. Instead of admitting powerlessness, they moralize it. This is where the concept of resentment becomes important, not as anger, but as a slow emotional pressure that reshapes values from the inside. Resentment doesn't usually announce itself. It doesn't say, "I'm bitter." It says, "This way is better." It says, "That kind of life is wrong anyway." It quietly turns inability into principle. If you can't compete, competition becomes immoral. If you can't dominate, dominance becomes evil. If you can't assert yourself, assertiveness becomes selfish. This isn't a conscious strategy. It's psychological survival. The book doesn't accuse people of lying to themselves. It suggests something more subtle. People often believe their moral judgments, even when those judgments are shaped by frustration or fear. Over time, these beliefs become sincere, convincing, deeply felt. And once they're moralized, they gain power. Because moral judgments don't just describe the world, they evaluate it. They tell you who deserves respect and who doesn't, who should feel proud and who should feel ashamed. And shame, once internalized, is incredibly effective. That's why the book spends so much time examining guilt. Guilt isn't just about wrongdoing, it's about desire, about impulse, about wanting things that your values say you shouldn't want. And when guilt becomes automatic, people don't need to be controlled from the outside. They regulate themselves. You begin to feel guilty not for what you do, but for who you are. I started noticing how often moral language targets inner states rather than actions. Thoughts, feelings, intentions, wanting too much, wanting differently, wanting at all. This shifts morality from behaviour into identity. It's no longer about what you did, it's about what kind of person you are. That move is powerful, because once morality reaches identity, questioning it feels like self-betrayal. The book doesn't deny that restraint can be valuable. It questions whether restraint has become idealized simply because it's easier to manage, easier to teach, easier to enforce, easier to normalize. A restrained population is predictable, calm, governable, and predictability often masquerades as goodness. This perspective changes how you look at praise, being called humble, modest, well-behaved, reasonable. On the surface, these sound positive, but they often describe someone who doesn't disrupt, who doesn't challenge, who doesn't make others uncomfortable. There's safety in that for everyone else. The book pushes you to ask whether moral systems are designed primarily to help individuals flourish, or to help societies remain stable. And those two goals don't always align. A society values peace, order, continuity. Individuals often need tension, risk, experimentation, growth. When those needs conflict, morality tends to side with stability. That's not a conspiracy, it's a pattern. What makes this uncomfortable is realizing how often moral outrage is less about harm and more about deviation. People are often less disturbed by suffering than by difference. Difference threatens shared assumptions. Shared assumptions hold groups together. So morality becomes a defense mechanism for the group, and a constraint on the individual. The book doesn't ask you to reject community, it asks you to notice when community begins to dictate your inner life, when external approval becomes the measure of internal worth, when being good matters more than being honest with yourself. This is where the tension sharpens, because once you see how values are shaped by fear, resentment, and the need for control, you're left with a difficult task, separating what genuinely supports life from what merely preserves comfort. That task has no shortcuts. You can't outsource it to tradition. You can't delegate it to authority. You can't resolve it through consensus. It requires awareness, and awareness comes with loneliness. The book makes it clear, not everyone is meant to question their values deeply, not because they are incapable, but because the cost is high. Questioning removes certainty, it dissolves familiar boundaries, it exposes you to judgment. Most people instinctively avoid that. But for those who don't, for those who feel an internal pressure to understand rather than conform, morality starts to look less like a sacred code and more like a human creation, shaped by history, emotion, and power dynamics that rarely get acknowledged. And once that understanding takes root, it doesn't turn you against others. It turns you inward. It forces you to ask whether your own judgments are rooted in clarity or comfort, whether your restraint comes from wisdom or fear, whether your values reflect strength or adaptation. And that question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It lingers, quietly, persistently, waiting to see whether you'll reach for the safety of familiar conclusions, or whether you'll sit with the discomfort long enough to discover which of your beliefs are truly yours, and which ones were absorbed long before you ever had the chance to decide. As the layers kept unfolding, the book slowly moved towards something even more uncomfortable. The idea that what we often call truth is rarely neutral. It's shaped, framed, interpreted through the lens of whoever is speaking and whoever is listening. I began noticing how confidently people talk about truth, as if it exists independently of perspective, as if facts alone guide belief. But the book keeps nudging you toward a quieter realization. Humans don't approach truth innocently. They approach it with needs, with fears, with desires, and those needs quietly influence what they're willing to see. This is where the idea of objectivity starts to feel fragile. The book doesn't claim that truth doesn't exist. It suggests something more subtle, that our access to truth is always filtered by biology, by history, by emotion, by position in the world. What feels obvious to one person can feel threatening to another, not because one is smarter, but because the consequences of accepting that truth are different. That explains why some ideas are praised as realistic, while others are dismissed as dangerous, even when both might be accurate. Truth isn't rejected because it's false. It's rejected because it disrupts something. Identity, hierarchy, comfort, or stability. I started noticing how often people accuse others of being biased, while assuming their own views are neutral. But the book challenges that assumption. It suggests that everyone has a perspective, and pretending otherwise is itself a form of bias. The difference is whether you are aware of it. That awareness matters, because unexamined perspectives don't just shape opinions, they shape values. The book pushes against the idea that reason alone governs human behaviour. Logic plays a role, but it's rarely the driver. People reason after they feel. They justify beliefs they already want to hold, and once those beliefs are wrapped in moral language, they become nearly immune to challenge. This made me rethink debates entirely. How often are people actually trying to understand? And how often are they simply defending a position that protects their sense of self? Once belief becomes identity, truth becomes secondary. The book also explores how language itself becomes a tool of influence. Words aren't just descriptions, they carry emotional weight. They frame experience, they assign meaning. Calling something natural, normal, or traditional gives it legitimacy without argument. Calling something radical, unnatural, or extreme discredits it before it's even examined. This isn't accidental, it's psychological. The more I noticed this, the more I realised how rarely people question the language they inherit. They use it automatically, and language, once internalised, quietly guides perception. It tells you what to admire, what to fear, what to dismiss. The book doesn't ask you to reject language, it asks you to listen to it more carefully, to notice what's being assumed, what's being smuggled in under familiar words, because once you accept the framing, you often accept the conclusion without realising it. This ties back to morality in an important way. Moral language tends to sound absolute. Certain words shut down conversation rather than open it. Once something is labelled wrong, curiosity feels inappropriate, questioning feels suspicious, and complexity disappears. That's when thinking becomes dangerous, not because it leads to chaos, but because it refuses to stop at comfortable answers. The book suggests that many people confuse certainty with strength, but certainty is often a sign of emotional investment, not understanding. Strength, in a deeper sense, shows up as the ability to tolerate ambiguity, to hold conflicting ideas without rushing to resolve them, to admit uncertainty without feeling diminished by it. That kind of strength is rare. Most people want clarity, not complexity. They want conclusions, not questions. and moral systems that offer clear answers are naturally appealing. They reduce cognitive load, they simplify decisions, they tell you how to judge yourself and others quickly. But that speed comes at a cost. When judgments become automatic, understanding slows down, nuance disappears, and people begin reacting rather than thinking. The book treats this as a loss, not of morality, but of depth. What struck me most was the idea that intellectual honesty often requires emotional courage. You have to be willing to sit with ideas that unsettle you, to question beliefs that make you feel secure, to admit that some of your convictions might be more about comfort than truth. That's not an easy process. It doesn't feel empowering at first, it feels destabilizing, like standing on ground that's shifting beneath you. But the book suggests that this instability is part of growth. Not something to avoid, but something to endure. Because without it, thinking becomes repetitive, predictable, safe. The book doesn't offer a final truth to replace the old ones. It doesn't promise clarity at the end of questioning, and instead reframes what it means to think honestly. Not as reaching certainty, but as remaining open, attentive, willing to revise. And that redefinition changes how you see disagreement. It's no longer a threat, it becomes information. A signal that different perspectives exist, shaped by different experiences and needs. Understanding doesn't require agreement, it requires awareness. This is where the narrative begins to turn inward again. Because once you accept that truth is filtered through perspective, you're forced to examine your own, to ask what your beliefs protect, what they cost, and what they allow you to avoid. That examination doesn't produce neat answers, it produces tension, a quiet pressure to be more careful with certainty, more curious about disagreement, more honest about why certain ideas appeal to you and why others don't. And as that pressure builds, the book subtly prepares you for a deeper shift, away from borrowed truths, away from inherited judgments, towards something more demanding and less comforting. The task of shaping your own understanding without relying on the illusion that your perspective is neutral, your values are universal, or your beliefs are free from the psychological forces that shape every human attempt to make sense of the world. As the book keeps pressing forward, it slowly brings attention to something most people rarely examine: the role of instinct. Not instinct as impulse or impulse as chaos, but instinct as a deeper intelligence that existed long before rules, explanations, or moral systems were put in place. What struck me was how often instinct is treated with suspicion. We're taught to control it, restrain it, override it. Desire becomes something to manage. Anger becomes something to suppress. Ambition becomes something to justify. Over time, instincts are framed as dangerous forces that must be disciplined into submission. And yet, the book keeps hinting at an uncomfortable possibility. What if instincts aren't the enemy, but the source? The idea isn't that every impulse should be followed blindly. It's that instincts are expressions of life pushing outward, seeking growth, expansion, experience. When those instincts are consistently denied or shamed, they don't disappear. They turn inward, they distort, they find indirect ways to express themselves. That's when people begin to feel divided against themselves. I started noticing how often people describe inner conflict as a moral struggle, good versus bad, higher self versus lower self. But the book reframes this conflict as something else entirely. Not a battle between virtue and vice, but a tension between life and restraint. When instincts are constantly treated as suspect, people begin to mistrust themselves. They second-guess desire. They hesitate before acting. They look outward for permission to feel what they already feel. Over time, this creates a subtle dependency, not on authority alone, but on moral reassurance. That dependency feels safe, but it comes with a loss of vitality. The book challenges the idea that suppression equals maturity. It asks whether what we call self-control is always a sign of wisdom and does a sinister. Sometimes a sign of fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of losing approval. Fear of discovering what you actually want if you stop censoring yourself. This isn't an argument against discipline. It's an argument against blind discipline. Discipline without understanding becomes rigid, mechanical, detached from life. And when that happens, morality starts serving control rather than growth. I began noticing how often people pride themselves on restraint without ever asking what they're restraining, or why, as if saying no automatically makes them better, as if denying desire is proof of character. But the book keeps pointing toward a different measure, not how much you suppress, but how consciously you live. Instincts, in this view, aren't commands, they're signals. They tell you where energy is flowing, where interest lives, where life is asking to be explored. Ignoring those signals doesn't make them go away, it just makes them harder to read. That's where the idea of life affirmation quietly enters. Not optimism, not positivity, but a willingness to engage fully with experience, including struggle, tension and contradiction, rather than escaping into rules that promise safety at the cost of intensity. The book contrasts this with a worldview that treats life as something to endure rather than express. A mindset that sees suffering as meaningful only if it's justified by some external reward. That perspective makes restraint noble and desire suspicious. It teaches people to tolerate life rather than participate in it. Over time, that tolerance turns into habit. I started noticing how many moral ideals revolve around endurance. Endure hardship, endure frustration, endure limitation. Endurance becomes proof of goodness. But the book asks a sharper question. Endure for what? If endurance leads to growth, clarity or strength, it may serve life. But if endurance becomes an end in itself, a way of avoiding change, it quietly drains vitality. People become proud of how much they can tolerate, not of what they can create. That's when morality stops pointing forward and starts pointing backward, toward preservation, towards sameness, toward maintaining what already exists. The book doesn't glorify instinct as raw impulse. It treats it as a foundation, something that must be understood, shaped, and integrated rather than denied. When instincts are acknowledged, people can choose how to express them. When they're suppressed, they tend to erupt in less conscious, less constructive ways. This reframing changes how you look at concepts like temptation and weakness. What if temptation isn't a moral failing, but a signal of unmet energy? What if weakness isn't desire itself, but the inability to engage with it honestly? That question lingers. The book suggests that many moral systems teach people to fear themselves, to view inner life as something that must be constantly corrected, and once that fear settles in, people stop trusting their own experiences. They rely on external frameworks to tell them what's acceptable to feel. That reliance creates order, but it also creates distance. Distance from instinct, from desire, from the raw material of life. What began to emerge for me was a sense that the book isn't trying to tear anything down violently. It's trying to reorient attention, away from inherited judgments, away from automatic restraint, toward a deeper awareness of what drives us beneath moral language. Because once you understand those drives, you're no longer ruled by them, but you're also no longer at war with them. That balance is difficult. It doesn't offer the comfort of strict rules or clear prohibitions. It requires attentiveness, reflection, responsibility, and that's precisely why it's rare. Most people prefer systems that decide for them, systems that reduce inner complexity into simple labels, but the book keeps returning to the same quiet insistence. Life is complex, and pretending otherwise comes at a cost. As this idea settles, it prepares the ground for something even more challenging. The suggestion that denying instinct doesn't make people moral. It often makes them resentful, and resentment, when left unexamined, doesn't disappear. It reshapes values, it hardens judgments, it seeks expression. That's when morality begins to carry a different tone, less about care, more about condemnation, less about understanding, more about control. And once you begin to sense that shift, you can't help but notice how often moral certainty is fueled not by clarity, but by suppressed energy looking for release. How often judgment masks frustration, and how frequently the loudest moral voices are not the most grounded, but the most internally divided, struggling against instincts they were never taught to understand, only to silence. As that connection between suppressed instinct and resentment became clearer, the book began to reveal something even more unsettling. How resentment doesn't just stay personal. It slowly transforms into a moral worldview. Resentment in this sense, isn't loud anger. It's quieter, heavier. It builds when people feel unable to act, unable to express themselves fully, unable to move toward what they want. When action feels blocked long enough, energy has to go somewhere. And often, it goes into judgment. Instead of saying, I can't do this, the mind shifts to, this shouldn't be done. Instead of, I don't have this, it becomes, this isn't worth having. Instead of, I feel powerless, it turns into, power itself is corrupt. This shift protects the ego. It keeps self-respect intact, but it also reshapes values. The book suggests that many moral systems are not born from abundance but from constraint, from lives lived under pressure, where direct expression felt dangerous or impossible. In those conditions, morality becomes a way of regaining control, not over the world, but over meaning. If you can't change your position, you change how you interpret it. That's when weakness starts presenting itself as virtue. Endurance becomes moral superiority. Submission becomes goodness. And strength, especially visible, unapologetic strength, starts to feel offensive. Not because it harms anyone directly, but because it reminds people of what they've learned not to want. This idea was difficult to sit with, because it doesn't flatter anyone. It doesn't divide people neatly into villains and victims. It suggests that entire value systems can grow out of emotional adaptation rather than clarity. And once those systems take root, they feel righteous, necessary, even compassionate. That's what makes them so powerful. The book keeps returning to the idea that moral judgments often say more about the judge than about the thing being judged. What offends you reveals what threatens you. What you condemn reveals what you've been forced to renounce. That doesn't mean every judgment is resentful, but it does mean resentment is far more common than people like to admit, especially when restraint has been glorified for generations. I started noticing how often moral outrage carries a sense of relief, as if condemning something releases pressure, as if judgment provides an outlet for energy that can't be expressed elsewhere. In that moment, morality becomes less about protecting others and more about regulating internal tension. The book doesn't describe this to excuse cruelty. It describes it to explain why cruelty often hides behind moral language. Once resentment becomes moralized, it stops looking like bitterness. It starts looking like principle, and principles are hard to argue with. They don't need to explain themselves, they demand agreement. This is where the danger lies. When resentment dresses itself as morality, it gains authority. It can shame, condemn, and restrict, all while believing it's acting for the greater good. And because it feels justified, it rarely reflects on its own motives. That's how moral systems become rigid, defensive, hostile to questioning. The book points out that genuinely life-affirming values don't need to shout. They don't need to police others aggressively. They don't need constant reinforcement. They come from fullness, not lack, from strength, not suppression. By contrast, values born from resentment tend to be reactive. They define themselves by what they oppose. They need enemies. They need violations to point at. Without something to condemn, they lose clarity. This explains why some moral movements seem to thrive on outrage, why peace doesn't satisfy them, why resolution feels empty. Their energy comes from resistance, not creation. That realization shifts how you interpret moral intensity. Loud certainty starts to look less like conviction and more like compensation. The book also challenges the idea that suffering automatically produces wisdom. Suffering can deepen understanding, but only when it's processed honestly. When suffering is endured without reflection, it often produces bitterness instead, and bitterness, when combined with moral authority, becomes dangerous. That's why the book is skeptical of ideals that glorify suffering for its own sake. Not all pain refines, some pain distorts. Some pain hardens people into judges rather than creators. I began noticing how often people take pride in how much they've endured, as if endurance itself were proof of insight. But endurance alone doesn't teach, it only builds pressure. What matters is what that pressure turns into, clarity or resentment. This is where the book subtly shifts the question again. Instead of asking, is this value right or wrong, it asks, where did this value come from? Was it shaped by growth, curiosity and strength, or by fear, frustration and constraint, that question changes everything. Because once you start tracing values back to their emotional origins, they lose their untouchable quality. They become human, conditional, revisable, and that realization doesn't weaken ethics. It makes them more honest. It forces you to examine your own reactions more carefully, to ask whether your judgments come from understanding or from unexpressed tension, whether your ideals expand life or quietly shrink it. The book doesn't tell you to abandon morality. It asks you to outgrow moral innocence, to stop assuming that good intentions guarantee good values, to recognize that even the most noble principles can be shaped by unresolved frustration. That recognition is uncomfortable. It removes the comfort of moral certainty. It replaces it with self-examination. But it also opens the door to something else, the possibility of values that aren't reactive, values that don't exist to restrain, condemn, or equalize, but to express, create, and affirm. And that possibility quietly points toward the next shift in the book, away from values born in reaction to life, and toward values created from engagement with it. Not values that say no by default, but values strong enough to say yes without fear. Values that don't need enemies to define themselves. Values that come from an inner fullness rather than an inner lack. And that question, once it takes shape, begins to draw a line between two fundamentally different ways of living. One rooted in resistance, and the other in creation. As that distinction between resistance and creation became clearer, the book began to shift its attention toward a different kind of human being, not as an ideal to worship, but as a contrast, a way of showing what life looks like when it's driven by creation rather than reaction. What stood out to me was how rarely we talk about creation in this sense, not creativity as art or productivity, but creation as orientation, as a way of relating to life. Most people spend their energy responding, reacting to expectations, correcting themselves, adapting to pressure. Very little energy is left for shaping anything from within. The book suggests that reactive living feels busy, but it's hollow. You're always answering something, never initiating, always adjusting, never defining. And over time, that habit makes people forget they could live differently. Creation, in contrast, begins quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for permission. It starts with a shift in posture, claimed. From asking, what is allowed, to asking, what feels true to my nature? That question is uncomfortable because it has no external answer. There's no authority to consult, no rulebook to reference. And that's precisely why most people avoid it. The book doesn't describe creators as happier or more moral. It describes them as more alive, more internally aligned, less dependent on approval. They don't define themselves by opposition. They don't need to condemn in order to exist. Their values grow out of engagement, not resentment. This difference changes how you see ambition. In reactive systems, ambition is suspicious. It disrupts balance. It introduces inequality. It reminds people of what they haven't pursued, so it gets moralized as greed or arrogance. But from a creative perspective, ambition is simply energy moving forward. It's life expressing interest in expansion. The problem isn't ambition itself. It's ambition without awareness. Just like instinct, ambition can be destructive when unconscious, but when understood, it becomes generative. The book keeps returning to this theme. Suppression doesn't eliminate force, it redirects it. When ambition is suppressed, it often reappears as judgment. When desire is suppressed, it often reappears as control. When strength is suppressed, it often reappears as moral authority. Creation short-circuits the cycle. Instead of denying impulse, it integrates it. Instead of condemning difference, it explores it. Instead of demanding equality of outcome, it respects difference of capacity. That respect isn't cruelty. It's honesty. This is where the book becomes especially unsettling for modern readers. It refuses to flatten human experience into sameness. It suggests that people are different, not just in preference, but in drive, tolerance, intensity, and capacity. And pretending otherwise doesn't make society fairer, it makes it less honest. The book doesn't argue that some people deserve more dignity than others. It argues that dignity doesn't come from equality of ability. It comes from authenticities of expression. Forcing everyone into the same moral mold doesn't elevate the weak. It limits the strong and breeds quiet resentment on both sides. That idea is easy to misunderstand. It's often read as elitism, but the book isn't praising domination. It's criticizing denial. Denial of difference, denial of instinct, denial of life's unevenness. I started noticing how often people say they want equality, when what they really want is reassurance. Reassurance that they won't be left behind, that they won't be judged by standards they didn't choose, that they won't have to confront uncomfortable comparisons. Those fears are human, but when they harden into values, they can quietly turn against growth. Creation, as the book frames it, isn't about stepping on others. It's about stepping forward without asking permission from fear. It's about taking responsibility for your own shape rather than demanding the world be reshaped to accommodate your avoidance. That responsibility is heavy. It means you can't hide behind collective values when you fail. You can't blame the system when you don't act. You can't claim moral purity as a substitute for effort. Most people don't want that burden. They prefer moral narratives that explain their position without demanding transformation. Narratives that turn limitations into virtues. Narratives that reward endurance without asking whether endurance is leading anywhere. The book quietly refuses those narratives. It doesn't shame people for choosing safety. It simply shows the cost. Safety trades intensity for predictability. It trades depth for stability. And over time, that trade-off dulls experience. Life becomes manageable, but smaller. Creation, on the other hand, increases risk. It invites failure. It exposes you to judgment. But it also deepens engagement. It gives shape to energy rather than suppressing it. That's why creators are often misunderstood. From the outside, they can look selfish, excessive, or reckless. But from the inside, they're often responding to a pressure that can't be relieved through compliance. A pressure to express something real. The book suggests that societies often rely on creators while morally distrusting them. They benefit from innovation, change, and disruption, but they condemn the traits that produce those outcomes. Strength is useful, but uncomfortable. Independence is admired, but only in hindsight. That contradiction explains a lot. It explains why creative individuals are celebrated after they're gone but resisted while they're alive. Why deviation is condemned until it becomes normalized. Why morality lags behind life rather than leading it. As this realization settles, the book prepares you for its most demanding shift yet. The idea that creating values isn't about choosing what feels good or what benefits you personally. It's about aligning your values with life itself, with growth, challenge, tension, and transformation. That alignment doesn't come with comfort. It comes with friction. It asks you to give up the security of being right in exchange for the honesty of being real. And that trade-off forces a question most people avoid asking: whether they want a life that feels morally approved, or a life that feels fully lived, even if that means carrying the weight of misunderstanding, criticism, and solitude that often follows those who stop reacting to the world as it is and begin shaping themselves according to something deeper than inherited rules. As the idea of creation settled more deeply, the book began to circle around a truth that feels uncomfortable precisely because it's quiet. Creating your own values doesn't make life easier, it makes it heavier. Most people imagine freedom as relief. Fewer rules, fewer limits, less pressure. But the book keeps pushing in the opposite direction. Freedom, in this sense, is not lightness, it's weight. Because once you stop borrowing values, there's no one left to blame for how you live. That realization changes everything. When you inherit rules, failure feels external. You didn't break them perfectly. You didn't live up to expectations. You tried. But when you create your own values, failure becomes personal. There's no authority to disappoint except yourself. No system to hide behind. No moral script to explain why you stayed small. That's why so many people retreat back into ready-made meanings. Not because they're false, but because they're forgiving. They absorb responsibility. They soften the consequences of inaction. The book suggests that most people don't actually want freedom. They want relief from guilt without accepting responsibility. They want to feel justified without having to transform. And morality, when inherited, offers exactly that. Creation offers no such comfort. Creating values means accepting that your life is an experiment, that some choices will be wrong, that some instincts will mislead you, that growth involves error. There's no final version of yourself to reach and lower, only continual adjustment. That's exhausting for anyone who craves certainty. The book contrasts this with a life built around obedience. Obedience simplifies decision-making. It reduces inner conflict. It allows you to measure yourself against external standards. You know where you stand, you know what's expected, and that clarity feels calming. But it also narrows possibility. I started noticing how often people equate responsibility with burden, as something to avoid rather than something that gives shape to life. But the book reframes responsibility as orientation. It gives direction to energy. Without it, desire scatters. With it, desire becomes purpose. That reframing shifts how you understand meaning itself. Meaning isn't discovered. It's created through sustained engagement, through choosing what matters and committing to it. Not because it's guaranteed to work, but because it resonates deeply enough to be worth the risk. Most people wait for meaning to arrive fully formed. The book suggests that waiting is the mistake. Meaning grows in proportion to responsibility. The more responsibility you're willing to carry, the deeper meaning you're capable of creating. That idea runs against everything comfort-oriented systems teach. Comfort systems reward compliance. They reward fitting in. They reward predictability. Responsibility, when it threatens stability, is discouraged. Risk is moralized as recklessness. Failure is moralized as irresponsibility, and ambition is treated with suspicion. The book isn't arguing against care or consideration. It's arguing against fear disguised as virtue. What really stayed with me was the idea that many people use morality to protect themselves from disappointment. If you never try, you never fail. If you never want too much, you never feel loss. If you never reach beyond your assigned role, you never feel exposed. Morality becomes a safety net for the ego. But safety has limits. A life organized around avoiding pain eventually avoids depth as well, and the book keeps returning to this quiet warning. Avoiding pain doesn't eliminate it. It just transforms it into something duller and more persistent. A sense of stagnation, of unused potential, of energy turned inward. That kind of pain doesn't scream. It hums. The book suggests that many people confuse peace with numbness. They call it balance, stability, contentment. But beneath it is often unexpressed tension, a life lived slightly below capacity. Not because more wasn't possible, but because more felt dangerous. Creation disrupts that numbness. It reintroduces tension, not as chaos, but as movement. Growth requires friction, and friction feels uncomfortable at first. That's why creators are often misunderstood as restless or dissatisfied. But dissatisfaction in this context isn't ingratitude, it's sensitivity, an awareness that something within is asking to be developed rather than suppressed. The book doesn't promise happiness as a reward for this path. It doesn't romanticize struggle. It simply suggests that a life aligned with growth feels more honest than a life organized around avoidance. Honesty, in this sense, isn't about telling the truth to others. It's about not lying to yourself about what you want, what you fear, and what you're capable of. That honesty forces you to confront trade-offs most people prefer to ignore. You can't have depth without discomfort. You can't have freedom without responsibility. You can't create values without risking being wrong. Those trade-offs don't disappear with time. They define the shape of your life. The book makes it clear that not everyone needs to walk this path. Many people are content within inherited structures. They find meaning in belonging, continuity, and shared values. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But for those who feel a persistent unease, a sense that the rules don't quite fit, that the explanations feel thin, that life could be lived more intensely, the book acts like a mirror. It doesn't give instructions, it reflects a possibility. A possibility that living fully might require giving up the comfort of moral certainty. That responsibility might feel heavier than obedience, but also more grounding. That creating values doesn't make you superior, it makes you accountable. And that accountability, once accepted, changes how you experience everything. Success feels earned, failure feels instructive, choices feel real. As this understanding deepens, the book prepares for an even more demanding idea, that self-creation isn't a one-time act, it's a continuous process, a constant testing and reshaping of values in response to life itself. There's no arrival point, no final justification, only movement. And once you sense that, you begin to see how many people are exhausted not because life is too demanding, but because they're carrying values that no longer fit them, values inherited for safety, maintained for approval, and defended out of habit. And how releasing those values doesn't bring immediate relief, but it does bring something rarer, the chance to live in alignment with forces that feel genuinely alive rather than merely acceptable. As the idea of constant self-creation settled in, the book slowly introduced a figure that's often misunderstood, not as a superhero, not as a ruler over others, but as a symbol of a different relationship with life itself. What struck me was how easily this idea gets distorted. People hear it and imagine dominance, ego, or cruelty, but the book isn't pointing toward control over others, it's pointing toward mastery over oneself, something far rarer and far more difficult. Most people spend their lives being shaped by forces they barely notice. Habits, expectations, fear of judgment, the desire to belong. These forces quietly mould behaviour until reacting becomes second nature. Self-mastery, in contrast, requires awareness. It means noticing what drives you before it drives you. That awareness is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. The book suggests that true strength isn't loud. It doesn't need to prove itself. It doesn't rely on comparison. It shows up as the ability to endure inattention without collapsing into distraction, blame, or moral outrage. This reframing changes how you see power. Power isn't about domination. It's about integration, bringing instinct, reason, and desire into alignment rather than letting them pull in opposite directions. Most people live divided lives, wanting one thing, believing another, doing a third. That division drains energy. Integration restores it. I started noticing how often people confuse control with mastery. Control is rigid. It suppresses. It forces. Mastery is flexible. It understands. It channels. Control says no by default. Mastery asks where the energy wants to go, and how it can be shaped without being denied. That distinction matters, because control breeds rebellion. When instincts are controlled harshly, they push back. They find indirect outlets. They show up as resentment, obsession, or judgment. Mastery, on the other hand, doesn't provoke resistance. It listens first. The book challenges the idea that moral strictness equals inner order. Often, strictness masks fragility. The tighter the rules, the less trust there is in oneself. When people don't trust their own instincts, they cling to systems that promise safety. But safety isn't the same as alignment. Alignment requires risk. It means acting from understanding rather than permission. It means accepting that you might misjudge, fail, or be misunderstood, and continuing anyway. That's why the book emphasizes self-overcoming rather than self-denial. Denial freezes growth. Overcoming transforms it. You don't erase your impulses, you refine them. You don't reject desire, you deepen it. This perspective reshapes how you think about struggle. Struggle isn't something to escape, it's something to work through. Not all struggle is meaningful, but struggle that leads to greater coherence within yourself has value. It builds capacity. Capacity to choose rather than react. Capacity to stand alone without bitterness. Capacity to create without needing approval. The book keeps hinting that most suffering comes not from life's difficulty, but from resistance to it. From fighting instincts rather than understanding them. From clinging to values that no longer fit rather than updating them. When resistance drops, energy frees up. That doesn't mean life becomes easy. It means it becomes clearer. You see where effort matters and where it's wasted. You stop moralizing your own hesitation. You start asking better questions. Instead of, should I want this? You ask, what does this desire reveal? Instead of, is this allowed? You ask, what would it cost to pursue this honestly? Instead of, what will people think? You ask, what happens if I don't act? Those questions don't come with comforting answers, but they lead somewhere real. The book doesn't suggest cutting ties with others or rejecting society. It suggests a different posture toward it, one that doesn't require constant agreement or rebellion. You can participate without dissolving into conformity. You can disagree without resentment. That balance is difficult because it offers no emotional shortcuts. You don't get the satisfaction of feeling morally superior. You don't get the relief of blaming the system. You carry your choices yourself. But carrying them gives them weight. I began to see how many people live lightly, not because they're free, but because they've offloaded responsibility. They let tradition decide. They let consensus decide. They let outrage decide. And in doing so, they give up something subtle but essential: authorship. Authorship over your life changes how you experience time. Days stop feeling interchangeable. Choices stop feeling abstract. You're no longer waiting for permission to become something. You're working with what's already there. The book frames this as a long process, not a transformation moment. There's no finish line, no stable identity to reach. Self-overcoming doesn't end. As soon as you grow, new limits appear. New tensions arise, new questions demand attention. That ongoing tension isn't a flaw, it's a sign of life. What the book ultimately pushes against is the idea of final answers, final morals, final identities. Anything final tends to harden, and hardened systems break under pressure. Living, by contrast, requires flexibility, responsiveness, a willingness to revise yourself as conditions change. This is why the book can feel unsettling. It doesn't let you rest in conclusions. Just as you think you understand it, it shifts the angle. It reminds you that understanding itself is provisional, shaped by where you stand now, not where you'll stand next. And that reminder does something subtle. It loosens the grip of certainty. It replaces the need to be right with the capacity to adapt. It invites you to treat life not as a problem to be solved, but as a force to be engaged with intelligently. As that invitation takes shape, the book prepares you for its most demanding implication yet, that living this way doesn't just change how you think, it changes how you relate to time, failure, success, and even suffering. Because once you stop measuring life against borrowed standards, you begin measuring it against something far less forgiving and far more honest, the extent to which you are actually becoming what your own nature makes possible, rather than what the world quietly trained you to accept. As that idea settled, that life isn't something to be solved but something to be engaged, the book slowly turned toward time. Not clocks or calendars, but how people experience time when they're living reactively versus creatively. Most people experience time as something that happens to them. Days pass, weeks blur together. Life feels like a sequence of obligations and recoveries. You get through things, you wait for breaks, you look forward to moments when pressure eases. The book suggests this isn't accidental. When your values come from outside you, time loses texture. Each day is measured by how well you complied, how little trouble you caused, how smoothly you fit in. There's motion, but little direction. Creative living changes that relationship. When you begin shaping values from within, time stops feeling neutral. Choices start to matter more. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're intentional. You're no longer just filling hours, you're investing them. An investment brings risk. You can waste time, you can misjudge, you can commit to things that don't pay off. But that risk also makes time feel real. The book challenges the idea that stability is the highest good. Stability makes time predictable, but it also flattens it. Without tension, days become interchangeable. Without challenge, growth slows. And without growth, time feels repetitive rather than meaningful. That's why so many people feel exhausted, even when their lives are relatively comfortable. It's not the workload, it's the lack of engagement. Energy drains when effort isn't connected to something that feels internally chosen. The book keeps returning to this idea. Meaning isn't found by avoiding difficulty, it's created by confronting it willingly. Difficulty becomes meaningful when it's tied to something you've chosen to care about, not something imposed by expectation or fear. This reframes how you see suffering. Suffering isn't noble by default. It's only meaningful when it's connected to growth, learning, or transformation. Suffering endured for the sake of obedience or approval doesn't deepen life. It narrows it. It trains endurance without direction. I started noticing how often people wear suffering as proof of virtue, as if pain alone earns meaning. But the book is skeptical of that idea. Pain can just as easily harden people. It can make them smaller, not deeper. What matters isn't how much you endure, it's what endurance leads to. This is where the idea of affirmation quietly enters again. Affirmation doesn't mean enjoying pain. It means not resenting life for its difficulty. It means engaging with reality as it is, rather than wishing it were easier or fairer. That shift matters, because resentment toward life drains energy. It keeps you focused on what shouldn't be instead of what could be shaped. Over time, resentment turns into fatigue, not physical, but existential, a sense that effort isn't worth it. The book treats that fatigue as a warning sign, not that life is meaningless, but that values are misaligned, that energy is being spent in directions that don't lead anywhere, that time is being consumed rather than used. Creative values realign time with effort. They don't remove struggle, they give it context. That context changes how failure feels. When your goals come from inherited standards, failure feels humiliating. You didn't meet expectations. You fell short of what you were supposed to be. Shame creeps in. But when goals are self-created, failure feels different. It's still painful, but it's informative. It tells you where your understanding was incomplete, where your judgment needs refinement. Failure becomes feedback rather than condemnation. That shift doesn't make failure pleasant. It makes it useful. The book doesn't romanticize struggle. It insists on honesty. If something drains you consistently without deepening you, it's worth questioning. Even if it's socially approved, even if it looks respectable, even if it earns praise. That idea is quietly radical. It suggests that a life that looks successful from the outside can still be misaligned, and a life that looks unconventional can still be deeply grounded. Appearances matter far less than coherence, the alignment between what you value, what you do, and how you experience time. Coherence doesn't arrive automatically. It requires revision, letting go of values that no longer fit, updating priorities as you change, accepting that what mattered at one stage of life might not matter at another. Most people resist this because it threatens identity. If you've defined yourself by certain values for long enough, letting go feels like erasing part of yourself. But the book suggests the opposite. Refusing to revise values erases growth. Growth requires flexibility. That flexibility extends to how you relate to success as well. Success, when measured by external standards, can feel strangely empty. You achieve what you were supposed to want, and then wonder why satisfaction fades so quickly. The book frames this not as ingratitude, but as misalignment. You climbed the wrong mountain, not because it was bad, but because it wasn't yours. Creative living doesn't guarantee satisfaction, it guarantees relevance. Your efforts connect to something that feels real to you, even when they're difficult, even when results are uncertain. That relevance makes time feel alive. I began to see how many people are waiting for life to begin once conditions improve, once they're secure enough, once approval is guaranteed, once uncertainty disappears. But the book quietly dismantles that waiting. It suggests that waiting for safety often becomes a way of avoiding engagement. Life doesn't start when risk ends, it starts when you decide what's worth risking for. That decision doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with discomfort, with doubt, with moments of hesitation. But it also comes with clarity, not about outcomes, but about direction. As this understanding deepens, the book prepares for another demanding shift, away from reacting to the past and toward relating differently to what has already happened. Because how you interpret your past shapes how you approach the future. And the book suggests that many people remain trapped not by events themselves, but by the meanings they attach to them. Meanings shaped by guilt, regret, and resentment that quietly drain the present of its energy, unless they're re-examined and reworked into something that no longer holds life hostage to what cannot be changed. As the focus turned toward the past, the book approached it in a way that felt both unsettling and strangely liberating, not as something to escape, forget, or endlessly analyze, but as something to confront differently. Most people carry their past like a weight. Regret sits quietly in the background. Guilt resurfaces at unexpected moments. Certain memories feel unfinished, unresolved, heavy, and without realizing it, people organize their present lives around avoiding those feelings. The book suggests that this avoidance shapes more of our behavior than we'd like to admit. When people are ashamed of their past choices, they often compensate by clinging to moral certainty in the present. Clear rules feel reassuring. Fixed values feel safe. They promise that mistakes won't happen again, as long as you stay within the lines. But that safety comes at a cost. The book doesn't treat regret as a moral failing, it treats it as a signal, a sign that life was lived reactively rather than consciously, that something happened without being fully owned, and ownership once missed doesn't disappear, it waits. What struck me was how strongly the book pushes against the idea of wishing the past were different. Not because the past was good, but because wishing doesn't change anything. Worse, it divides you from your own life. It turns your history into an enemy rather than a foundation. The book proposes a far more demanding relationship with the past, acceptance without resentment. Not acceptance as approval, acceptance as acknowledgement. This happened. This was chosen. This shaped me. And instead of asking how it could have been avoided, the question becomes how it can be integrated. That shift is difficult because resentment feels justified. It gives you someone to blame. Yourself, others, circumstances. Letting go of resentment doesn't mean denying harm. It means refusing to let harm define the rest of your life. The book suggests that many people stay trapped not because their past was unbearable, but because they keep replaying it through the same moral lens. A lens shaped by guilt, shame, and if-only thinking. That lens freezes time. It locks energy into memory instead of directing it forward. What really unsettled me was the idea that clinging to regret can become a form of self-punishment, a way of proving moral seriousness without actually changing anything. As long as you feel bad enough, you don't have to act differently. Suffering becomes a substitute for transformation. The book quietly rejects that trade. It suggests that the only honest relationship with the past is one that turns it into fuel. Not inspiration in a shallow sense, but pressure. Pressure to live differently now, to act with more awareness, to choose deliberately rather than reactively. That pressure doesn't feel comforting. It feels demanding. Because once you accept the past fully, excuses disappear. You can't say, "I didn't know." You can't say, "It wasn't my fault." At least not in a way that frees you from responsibility. But responsibility in this context isn't punishment. It's continuity. It means your life makes sense as a whole rather than breaking into disconnected chapters. This reframing changes how you see mistakes. Mistakes aren't stains to hide, they're data. They show you where values were unclear, where instincts were ignored, where fear overruled understanding. If you're willing to look honestly, they teach faster than success ever could. The book doesn't encourage nostalgia either. Idealizing the past can be just as paralyzing as regretting it. Nostalgia turns memory into a refuge. It makes the present feel inadequate by comparison. Once again, life is postponed. The book's stance is firm but quiet. The past has no authority over you unless you give it one. That doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to let memory dictate identity. You are not who you were, but you are shaped by who you were. Denying that shape weakens you. Accepting it gives you leverage. I began to notice how many people define themselves by a single chapter of their lives. One failure, one success, one turning point. But life isn't a verdict, it's a process. And processes don't end until you stop participating. This perspective changes how you relate to guilt in a deep way. Guilt can be useful when it leads to correction. But when it lingers beyond that, it becomes corrosive. It drains energy that could be used for growth. It keeps attention fixed backward instead of forward. The book suggests that living well requires a kind of loyalty to your life as a whole, including its darker parts. Loyalty doesn't mean justification. It means refusal to disown yourself. That refusal is powerful because once you stop fighting your own history, you free up attention. Energy returns. You're no longer split between who you were and who you want to be. That integration prepares the ground for one of the book's most demanding ideas. a thought experiment so intense that many people instinctively reject it the moment they encounter it. Not because it's irrational, but because it strips away every remaining excuse. The idea asks you to imagine your life repeating exactly as it is. Every choice, every pain, every mistake, again and again. Not as punishment, as a question. If this were to happen, would you curse your life or affirm it? That question isn't meant to be answered quickly. It's meant to expose something. To reveal whether your values lead to a life you can stand behind, not selectively, not conditionally, but as a whole. And once that question enters your thinking, it doesn't leave easily. It lingers beneath daily decisions. It watches how you choose. It listens to how you justify. It quietly asks whether you're building a life you could accept without resentment, or one that depends on the hope that someday, somehow, it will finally feel different. That question, whether you could accept your life exactly as it is, doesn't sound too dramatic at first, but the more time you sit with it, the heavier it becomes, because it doesn't ask about your intentions, or your excuses, or your hopes for the future. It asks about what you're actually living. The book treats this idea not as a theory, but as a mirror. If every moment of your life were to return, unchanged, would you resist it, or affirm it? Not once, not symbolically, but fully. What makes this so uncomfortable is that it removes escape routes. You can't lean on, it will get better later. You can't hide behind redemption arcs or future transformations. You're forced to look at the structure of your life as it is now. How you spend your time, how you make choices, how you respond to difficulty. And most people don't like what they see. The instinctive reaction is rejection. No one wants pain repeated. No one wants mistakes replayed. But the book isn't asking whether you enjoy every moment. It's asking whether your way of living is aligned enough that you could accept it without resentment. That distinction matters. Life includes difficulty. That's unavoidable. What the book questions is whether your difficulty is connected to something meaningful, or whether it's the result of avoidance, indecision, or borrowed values that don't fit you. If suffering is the cost of pursuing something you've chosen, it carries a different weight than suffering endured out of fear or habit. One deepens you, the other drains you. This idea reframes responsibility in a radical way. You're not responsible for controlling outcomes. You're responsible for choosing directions, and those directions shape whether life feels like something happening to you, or something you're participating in. The book doesn't suggest that you should judge yourself harshly using this question. It's not a test you pass or fail. It's a diagnostic tool. It shows you where your life is aligned and where it isn't. If the idea of repetition feels unbearable, it doesn't mean your life is worthless. It means something in the way you're living is unresolved. Something wants to change. Something is being postponed. That postponement shows up everywhere. In one day thinking, in waiting for permission, in hoping circumstances will improve before you act. The book quietly dismantles this waiting. It suggests that waiting for the right conditions is often just fear wearing a reasonable mask. Conditions are never perfect. They never stop changing. If you delay living until certainty arrives, you delay indefinitely. This is where the book's message becomes less philosophical and more practical. It's not asking you to think differently in theory. It's asking you to notice how your values show up in daily choices, in small, unremarkable moments that quietly accumulate into a life. How often do you choose comfort over clarity? How often do you avoid action to preserve approval? How often do you stay silent to maintain harmony, even when something inside you resists? These aren't moral questions, they're diagnostic ones. The book suggests that many people experience anxiety, not because life is too unpredictable, but because their actions don't reflect their deeper instincts. There's a gap between what they feel drawn toward and what they allow themselves to pursue. That gap creates tension, and when tension goes unaddressed, it turns into restlessness, resentment, or fatigue. Closing that gap doesn't require dramatic change. It requires honesty. Honesty about what you're avoiding. Honesty about what you're choosing by default. Honesty about the values you're living by, not the ones you claim to hold. The book's deeper challenge is this. If you had to live your life again, Exactly as it is, would you want to change your circumstances? Or your way of choosing within them? That question strips away fantasies. You can't escape into another life. You can't rewrite the past. You can only adjust how you engage with what's in front of you. This doesn't mean forcing positivity or pretending everything is fine. It means aligning your actions with your understanding, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. The book treats affirmation not as blind optimism, but as courage. The courage to say yes to life's difficulty without needing to justify it. The courage to accept responsibility without demanding guarantees. The courage to act in ways that you could stand behind, even if no one else applauds. That kind of courage doesn't feel heroic. It feels grounded, quiet, often lonely. But it also changes how you experience time. When you act in alignment with your values, moments stop feeling wasted, even painful ones. They become part of a coherent whole, something you can accept without needing escape fantasies. This is why the book places so much emphasis on becoming rather than arriving. There is no final state where everything is resolved. There is only ongoing alignment, a continuous adjustment between instinct, understanding, and action. When that alignment is missing, life feels like repetition in the worst sense, the same dissatisfaction replayed under different circumstances. When alignment is present, repetition takes on a different meaning. Even similar challenges feel purposeful because they're engaged with consciously. The book doesn't ask you to love every moment of your life. It asks you to live in a way that you wouldn't need to escape from it. That's a subtle but demanding standard. And once you begin to measure your life against that standard, you start seeing how many decisions are made out of fear rather than understanding. How often values are used to avoid risk rather than to guide growth. How easily people mistake endurance for integrity. The question of repetition doesn't judge you. It reveals you. It shows whether your values lead toward expansion or stagnation, toward engagement or avoidance. And as that revelation sinks in, the book begins to move toward its quiet conclusion, not by offering comfort, but by offering clarity. The clarity that life doesn't owe you meaning, but it does respond to how honestly you live it, and that meaning, when it appears, doesn't come from external approval or moral certainty. It emerges from the difficult ongoing act of choosing in a way that you could accept again and again, without resentment. Not because life is easy, but because it is fully, consciously yours. As the book begins to settle into that idea, living in a way you could accept again and again, it quietly removes one last illusion. The belief that life owes us fairness. Most people carry this belief without realizing it. If they work hard enough, behave well enough, endure long enough, something should balance out. Justice should arrive. Reward should follow. Pain should eventually be compensated. The book challenges this expectation directly, not by saying life is cruel, but by saying life is indifferent to our moral bookkeeping. Effort doesn't guarantee reward. Suffering doesn't guarantee wisdom. Good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. And once you accept this, something strange happens. Disappointment loses some of its power. Because disappointment is often born from expectation. The book suggests that many people feel betrayed by life, not because life treated them badly, but because they believed it was supposed to treat them well. That belief quietly shapes how they interpret everything that happens. When reality doesn't cooperate, resentment grows. Resentment toward fate, toward society, toward other people, toward life itself. And resentment, as the book has shown again and again, is corrosive. It turns attention backward. It drains energy. It hardens values into complaints. Letting go of the idea that life owes you something doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. You stop waiting for justification. You stop needing permission. You act because something matters to you, not because you expect a guarantee in return. That shift changes how you relate to effort. Effort is no longer a transaction. It's an expression. When you stop treating life like a contract, you stop asking, "What do I get for this?" and start asking, "Is this worth doing?" That question is harder. It doesn't rely on fairness. It relies on clarity. The book frames this as maturity. Not emotional detachment, but emotional honesty. You acknowledge disappointment without turning it into a worldview. You accept difficulty without turning it into grievance. You continue without demanding compensation. That doesn't mean suppressing frustration. It means not building an identity around it. I started noticing how often people organise their lives around what they feel entitled to: respect, recognition, security, happiness. When those things don't arrive, bitterness sets in, and bitterness, once it becomes habitual, shapes perception. Everything looks like evidence that the world is against you. The book suggests that this mindset quietly poisons initiative. Why act creatively if the world is unfair? Why take responsibility if effort isn't rewarded? Why try if disappointment is inevitable? Those questions sound reasonable, but they lead to stagnation. The alternative the book offers isn't optimism, it's sovereignty, a way of living where your actions aren't dependent on external validation, where meaning comes from expression rather than outcome. This doesn't make failure painless, it makes it bearable. Failure becomes part of the process rather than proof of injustice. That perspective also changes how you relate to others. When you stop expecting life to be fair, you stop demanding that people play specific roles for you. You stop moralizing their success or your disappointment. Comparison loosens its grip. Comparison thrives on the idea of fairness. If life were fair, differences would feel offensive. But once you accept unevenness as a fact, comparison loses its authority. You're no longer measuring yourself against others. You're measuring yourself against your own capacity for engagement. That shift is subtle but powerful. The book doesn't deny the reality of injustice. It denies its usefulness as a foundation for living. You can acknowledge injustice without letting it define you. You can respond to it creatively rather than reactively. That's the difference between action and resentment. Action doesn't require life to be fair. It requires clarity about what matters. Resentment requires belief in fairness, because without it there's no one to blame. As this understanding deepens, the book quietly redefines strength one last time. Strength isn't endurance alone. It isn't dominance. It isn't moral certainty. Strength is the capacity to continue without illusion. Without the illusion that suffering earns reward. Without the illusion that goodness guarantees safety. Without the illusion that meaning will be handed to you. Continuing without illusion doesn't make life bleak. It makes it real. And reality, once accepted, becomes workable. You stop fighting the world you're in and start shaping your place within it. You stop asking why things shouldn't be this way and start asking what you can do with how they are. That question doesn't have dramatic answers. It leads to small, consistent choices. Choices guided by understanding rather than expectation, by alignment rather than approval. The book never promises peace, it promises coherence. A life where your actions make sense to you, even when they're difficult, even when they don't pay off immediately, even when they go unnoticed. That coherence becomes its own reward. Because once you stop needing life to justify itself to you, you stop needing to justify yourself to life. You act, you adjust, you continue. And in that continuing, something settles. Not happiness, not certainty, but a steadiness. A sense that even when things are hard, you're not divided against yourself. That your values aren't borrowed. That your effort isn't wasted on maintaining illusions. The book's final movement isn't about reaching a conclusion. It's about arriving at a posture. A way of standing in the world without demanding that it bend to your expectations. A posture that accepts difficulty without bitterness. Difference without resentment, uncertainty without paralysis. And once you stand that way, the question of meaning stops feeling abstract. Meaning becomes something you practice, something you build through how honestly you live, how consciously you choose, and how willing you are to carry responsibility without asking life to promise anything in return. As the idea of living without illusion settled in, the book quietly turns its attention to something people rarely question. Why comfort feels so persuasive, even when it slowly drains life of intensity. Comfort isn't just physical ease, it's psychological. It's the feeling that nothing is demanded of you beyond what you already are, and that feeling is deeply seductive. It promises rest from effort, rest from doubt, rest from responsibility. The book doesn't treat comfort as evil. It treats it as dangerous when it becomes a value rather than a phase. When comfort becomes the goal, people stop asking what they're capable of. They stop stretching. They stop risking misunderstanding. Life becomes about maintaining equilibrium, not about becoming anything new. And over time, that equilibrium starts to feel like stagnation. What struck me was how often comfort disguises itself as wisdom. People say they've outgrown ambition, matured past struggle, accepted their limits. Sometimes that's true, but often it's fatigue pretending to be insight. The book keeps returning to this pattern. When energy drops, values change to justify the drop. Instead of admitting exhaustion, people reinterpret withdrawal as virtue. Instead of acknowledging fear, they call it realism. This is how decline becomes respectable. Not dramatic decline, subtle decline, a narrowing of desire, a shrinking of curiosity, a quiet agreement to want less because wanting more feels risky. The book isn't attacking peace, it's questioning peace without vitality. Because peace that comes from fulfillment feels different from peace that comes from resignation. One is alive, the other is quiet in a way that borders on numbness. I started noticing how often people confuse being content with being finished. As if reaching a certain age, position or level of security means growth should stop. As if stability were a signal to coast rather than a platform to build from. The book refuses that logic. It suggests that life doesn't reward those who settle. It simply moves past them. Not cruelly, indifferently. Energy flows where it's engaged. When engagement stops, energy moves elsewhere. This reframes the idea of decline. Decline isn't something that happens to you. It's something you drift into when you stop responding to life's demands for adaptation. Adaptation doesn't mean constant upheaval. It means responsiveness. Staying awake to change, in yourself and in the world. Updating values when circumstances shift. Letting go of identities that no longer fit. Most people resist this because identity feels safe. This is who I am feels grounding. But the book suggests that rigid identity is one of the most effective ways to avoid growth. Once you define yourself too tightly, change feels like betrayal. And morality often steps in to protect that identity. I'm not that kind of person. I don't believe in that. That's not how people like me live. These statements sound principled, but they often function as boundaries against transformation. They close doors before curiosity has a chance to speak. The book doesn't argue that you should abandon identity entirely. It argues that identity should be flexible, shaped by ongoing engagement rather than fixed by past choices. When identity hardens, life thins. This connects back to comfort in a subtle way. Comfort loves predictability. It prefers known routines over uncertain possibilities. And morality, when it's used to defend comfort, becomes conservative in the deepest sense. Not politically, but existentially. It resists change because change threatens ease. The book suggests that much of what people call wisdom is actually avoidance refined over time, a sophisticated way of saying no without admitting fear, a calm explanation for why growth is no longer necessary. True wisdom, in contrast, stays curious. It doesn't rush to closure. It remains open to being wrong. It accepts that understanding is provisional, that what makes sense now may need revision later. That openness requires energy, and energy requires engagement. This is why the book repeatedly returns to the idea of vitality, not as enthusiasm or optimism, but as responsiveness, being affected by life, letting it move you, allowing challenge to register instead of being filtered out by habit. I began to see how many people protect themselves from life by dulling their sensitivity. They call it balance. They call it maturity. But underneath there's often a quiet withdrawal, a decision to feel less in order to stay safe. The book doesn't shame this, it names it. And naming it creates a choice. You can choose comfort and stability, and accept the gradual narrowing that comes with it. Or you can choose engagement, and accept the friction, uncertainty, and vulnerability that follow. Neither choice is morally superior, but they lead to very different lives. The book's concern isn't with judging those choices, it's with honesty. with seeing which values are truly yours and which ones were adopted to justify retreat. Because once retreat is moralized, it becomes invisible. People stop noticing that they've stepped back from life. They believe they've arrived somewhere instead. That's why the book keeps unsettling rather than reassuring. It doesn't let you settle comfortably into conclusions. Just as you think you've understood it, it asks another question. It nudges another assumption. It keeps life in motion. And that motion is the point. Life, as the book presents it, isn't about reaching a state of rest. It's about maintaining responsiveness, staying awake, remaining capable of change. Comfort dulls that capacity. Engagement sharpens it. As this understanding deepens, the book prepares one final turn, away from critique and towards stance. Not a doctrine, not a prescription, but a way of holding yourself in the world that doesn't depend on comfort, fairness, or certainty. A stance that accepts instability as the price of vitality, that accepts misunderstanding as the cost of honesty, that accepts effort without demanding reward. And once that stance takes shape, life stops feeling like something to be endured or escaped. It becomes something to be met, fully, attentively, without the soft protections of comforting values that promise peace but quietly ask you to shrink in exchange. At that point, the book falls quiet. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because what remains can't be explained further. It has to be lived. As the book moves toward its final stretch, it stops dismantling ideas and starts revealing something quieter. The cost of asterisk, not asterisk, living this way. Not in dramatic terms, not as tragedy, but as something far more common. A slow thinning of life. Most people don't fail loudly. They don't collapse or fall apart. They adapt, they adjust, they settle, and from the outside their lives look fine, stable, reasonable, respectable. But internally, something narrows. Curiosity fades first, then risk, then intensity. Over time, even desire begins to feel inconvenient. People stop asking what excites them and start asking what's appropriate, what's expected, what won't cause trouble. The book treats this not as moral failure, but as drift. Drift happens when no force pulls you forward strongly enough to resist comfort. When values aren't actively chosen, they default to whatever reduces friction, whatever keeps things smooth, whatever avoids discomfort. And smoothness slowly becomes the highest good. That's when life becomes procedural. Days are managed rather than lived. Decisions are optimized for safety rather than meaning. You do what makes sense, but not what feels alive. The book suggests that this is why so many people feel restless without knowing why. There's no crisis, no obvious problem, just a quiet dissatisfaction that never fully goes away. That dissatisfaction isn't ingratitude, it's information. It's the signal that something within you isn't being used. The book never tells you what that something is. It can't. It's different for everyone. For some, it's creative energy. For others, it's leadership. For others, it's depth, intensity, or truthfulness. But whatever it is, when it's ignored for too long, it doesn't disappear. It turns into frustration, or numbness, or resentment disguised as morality. This is where many people turn values into armor. They say they don't care anymore. They say they've outgrown ambition. They say they're realistic now. But beneath those statements is often a withdrawal, not from ego but from possibility. The book doesn't condemn this withdrawal, and it asks what it costs. Because every value that protects you from discomfort also protects you from growth. Every rule that keeps you safe also limits where you can go. And every identity you cling to eventually becomes something you have to defend. That defense takes energy. I began noticing how tired people are. Not physically, but existentially. They're exhausted by maintaining coherence between who they are and the life they're actually living. When those don't align, it takes constant explanation, constant justification, constant moral reasoning. The book suggests that alignment simplifies life in an unexpected way, not because it removes difficulty, but because it removes self-contradiction. You stop spending energy pretending you don't want what you want. You stop arguing with yourself about what matters. That doesn't make decisions easier, it makes them cleaner. Clean decisions don't come with guarantees. But they don't leave residue either. Regret, resentment, self-contempt. These tend to arise not from failure but from avoidance, from knowing what matters and choosing comfort instead. The book keeps returning to this idea in different forms. Life punishes avoidance more reliably than it punishes risk. Risk can fail, avoidance always costs something. That cost doesn't arrive immediately, it accumulates quietly, in missed chances, in diluted days, in a sense of watching life rather than participating in it. The book isn't trying to frighten you into action, it's trying to clarify the stakes, to show that the question isn't whether life will be difficult. It will be. The question is whether that difficulty will feel chosen or imposed. Chosen. Difficulty strengthens. Imposed difficulty drains. That distinction runs through everything the book has explored. Morality, instinct, resentment, creation, responsibility, time, and comfort. They all circle the same point from different angles. When values are chosen consciously, difficulty becomes meaningful. When values are inherited passively, difficulty feels unfair. The book doesn't promise that choosing consciously will make you happier. It promises something subtler and more durable, coherence. A life where your actions make sense to you, even when they don't to others. That coherence is rare, and it's fragile. It requires ongoing attention. You don't achieve it once and keep it forever. You maintain it by noticing when you start slipping back into borrowed values, inherited fears and comfortable explanations. That noticing never ends. Which is why the book doesn't end with a conclusion or a solution. It ends with a stance, a way of meeting life without illusions, without the expectation of fairness, without the need for moral reassurance, without the hope that meaning will arrive fully formed someday. Meaning, as the book makes clear, is something you asterisk to asterisk, not something you receive. You do it by choosing values that expand rather than shrink you, by engaging rather than retreating, by carrying responsibility without turning it into resentment, by allowing life to be difficult without demanding that it justify itself. That way of living won't make you popular, it won't make you safe, it won't make you certain, but it will make your life yours. And that, more than comfort, more than approval, more than moral certainty, is what the book ultimately points toward. Not as an instruction, not as an ideal, but as a possibility that remains open as long as you're willing to notice when you're shrinking, and willing to choose again and again not the easiest values, but the ones that let you meet life without looking away. As the book reaches its quiet end, it doesn't offer relief. It offers something more demanding. Clarity without comfort. There's no final moral to take home, no rule to summarize everything neatly. Instead, there's a recognition that life, when lived honestly, refuses to be simplified, and any system that promises ease, certainty, or permanent peace is asking you to trade depth for reassurance. What stayed with me most is how the book refuses to separate thinking from living. These ideas aren't meant to stay in the mind. They press into how you choose, how you hesitate, how you justify, how you avoid. They expose the gap between what you claim matters and what your actions quietly reveal. That gap is where most people live. Not because they're dishonest, but because it's easier to explain yourself than to change. Easier to defend values than to test them. Easier to inherit meaning than to create it. The book never shames this. It simply shows the cost. When values aren't examined, life slowly becomes reactive. You respond to expectations, circumstances, pressures. You stay busy, you stay occupied. But something essential remains untouched, and over time that untouched part begins to feel like absence. That absence is often mistaken for boredom, burnout, or dissatisfaction. But the book frames it differently. It's the feeling of unused life. Unused doesn't mean wasted in a dramatic sense. It means underengaged, underclaimed, lived within safe margins rather than explored. What makes this difficult is that nothing forces you to change. You can live an entire life within those margins and never be punished for it. Society often rewards it. Stability is praised, predictability is trusted, safety is admired. But the book suggests that reward isn't the same as fulfillment. Fulfillment doesn't come from doing what's approved. It comes from acting in alignment with something you've examined and chosen, and that alignment can't be outsourced. No authority can grant it. No tradition can guarantee it. It has to be built, slowly, imperfectly, through decisions that carry personal weight. This is why the book never tells you what to believe. It treats belief itself as secondary. What matters is orientation. Are your values oriented toward expansion or contraction, toward engagement or avoidance, toward creation or protection? Those orientations show up everywhere, in how you speak, in what you tolerate, in what you postpone, in what you repeatedly explain away. The book's final effect isn't inspiration, it's exposure. After reading it becomes harder to hide behind moral language when you're afraid, harder to call withdrawal wisdom, harder to mistake endurance for purpose. You start noticing when your values are helping you face life, and when they're helping you avoid it. That awareness isn't pleasant, but it's precise. And precision changes behaviour. You may not overhaul your life overnight. The book doesn't expect that. What it changes is your tolerance for self-deception. Once you've seen how values are shaped, how morality can mask fear, how comfort can masquerade as insight, it becomes harder to unsee it. Small choices begin to matter more. Not because they're morally right or wrong, but because they signal direction, toward engagement or retreat, toward honesty or convenience, toward growth or preservation. The book leaves you with no conclusion because conclusions invite rest, and rest, when taken too seriously, turns into stagnation. Instead, it leaves you with tension, a productive tension between who you are and who you might become, between the values you inherited and the ones you're capable of creating, between the life that feels safe and the life that feels fully inhabited. That tension doesn't resolve, it guides. If you listen to it, it sharpens attention. It makes you question familiar explanations. It nudges you toward actions that feel slightly uncomfortable but deeply aligned. And if you ignore it, life still goes on, smoothly, quietly, respectably, but thinner. The book doesn't threaten you with a regret. It doesn't promise reward. It simply makes one thing difficult to avoid seeing, that every day, whether you notice or not, you're choosing a stance toward life, a stance of reaction or creation, of inheritance or authorship, of comfort or engagement. Those choices don't announce themselves. They hide in habits, in justifications, in what you repeatedly delay. Once you become aware of them, you don't become free in a dramatic sense. You become responsible, and responsibility, as the book has shown again and again, isn't light word, but it's grounding. It gives your life texture, direction, coherence. And that coherence, not happiness, not certainty, not approval, is what remains when illusions fall away. A life that makes sense to you, even when it's difficult, even when it's misunderstood, even when it offers no guarantees. That's where the book leaves you, not with answers, but with yourself. Aware enough to notice when you're shrinking, honest enough to admit when you're avoiding, and capable, if you choose, of stepping forward without needing permission from comfort, tradition, or fear. And that choice, quiet, ongoing, unglamorous, is the real challenge the book offers. Not once, not symbolically, but every day you're willing to ask, without distraction or excuse, whether the way you're living is something you can stand behind. Not because it's safe, but because it's yours. This book doesn't tell you how to live. It simply takes away the excuses. After it, it's harder to hide behind morality, harder to call comfort wisdom, harder to pretend you didn't notice. You begin to see where you're choosing safety over truth, approval over honesty, ease over growth, not dramatically, quietly, daily. The book doesn't promise happiness or meaning. It offers clarity. Clarity about what's inherited, what's chosen, and what you keep postponing. In the end, it leaves you with one thing: responsibility, not for the world, for your own life. And whether you change anything or not, that choice has always been yours.